evening, if you would take your Bibles, turn to Ephesians chapter 5. We'll be back in there once again, dealing with the family. Dealing with marriage in particular this evening. And it's been said, where is it? Where's my... Richard Baxter writing in his book, The Christian Directory, which is quite a fairly large book. If you ever get a chance to look at it, it's over 1 million words. I mean, for somebody writing in the 16th century, it's quite the book called The Christian Directory. And he writes about what is wrong in the world being attributed to the breakdown of the family all the way back into the 16th century. He says, so that it is an evident truth that most of the mischiefs that now infest or seize upon mankind throughout the earth consist in or are caused by the disorders and ill-governedness of families. These are the schools and shops of Satan, from whence proceed the beastly ignorance, lust, and sensuality, the devilish pride, malignity, and cruelty against the holy ways of God, which have so unmanned the progeny of Adam. These are the nests in which the serpent doth hatch the eggs of covetousness, envy, strife, revenge, tyranny, disobedience, wars, and bloodshed, and all the leprosy of sin that hath so odiously contaminated human nature, and all the miseries by which they make the world calamitous. And as we have made mention of several times in the studies, the fact that he writes that in the 16th century, we're in the 21st century, not much has changed. What's wrong with our society and our culture is the breakdown of the family. And so as we've been dealing with the family, and particularly a healthy marriage is possible only if a Christian foundation is in place. And these foundations are found in the dignity of marriage. These foundations, this dignity of marriage finds itself because it's a divine institution and it was instituted in innocency. It is for those able to perform the essential duties of marriage, its purposes and companionships and reproductions. We looked at a few things about marriage last week, and particularly the idea that marriage is frail and brief. As much as we think about life being as a vapor, marriage itself is frail and brief. Couples have a few years together. They should make the most of their time to encourage godliness in each other. And we can only do this if we are committed believers. We also looked at how the covenant commitment in marriage. We looked at Proverbs 2:17 and Malachi 2:14. Have we not made promises that we are obligated to keep? Are we all not weak, frail, and needy? And God provides us strength to keep these commandments. We looked at the crosses that attend to marriage. The fact that when we get married, there are going to be times in our life that we will have to carry either our spouse's cross for them or our spouse becomes a cross. And so we look at the crosses that attend marriage. And so there's religious commitments to marriage that are the foundation of the Christian marriage. And so as we move on from the overview of marriage, let's look at the husbands this evening. So we're there in Ephesians chapter 5. We'll get there momentarily. Ephesians chapter 5, we'll look in, I got to get there first. Look at verses 25 through the end of the chapter. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. And so, as you look at the husband first, we'll get into this in a moment, there are duties that are common to both husband and wives in a marriage relationship. One of those is mutual affection. In a marriage relationship, we would hope that we love one another, right? There may come times in your marriage relationship the feeling is not there, but yet you still love them anyway, because it's a choice. We are to entirely love each other and avoid all things that tend to quench that love. We have one body, we have one flesh, we have one soul, we have one spirit. Cleave in Matthew 9, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and then in Genesis chapter 2, the idea of cleaving unto your wife has the idea to be glued to his wife. So near that nothing can come between, and so firm that nothing can dissolve it. Interesting. The idea that the word cleave means to be glued to his wife. Nothing can come between the husband and wife, and nothing can dissolve it. Thomas Hooker, the Puritan founder of the Connecticut colony, he wrote of the church's love of Christ and Christ's love of the church, and he's writing using that analogy for the marital affection. Listen as he describes the ordinances of the church in relation to the husband and wife. As a wife deals with the letters of her husband, and that is in a far country, she finds many sweet inklings of his love. And she would talk with her husband afar off and see him in the letters. Oh, saith she, thus and thus he thought when he wrote these lines, and then she thinks he speaks to her again. She reads the letters only. Because she would be with her husband a little and have a little parley with him in her pen, though not in his presence. So these ordinances are but the Lord's love letters to us. He goes on writing about the husband's affection for his wife. The man whose heart is endeared to the woman he loves, he dreams of her in the night, hath her in his eye in apprehension when he awakes, thinks on her as he sits at the table, walks with her when he travels, and parleys with her in each place where he comes. That the husband tenders his spouse with an endeared affection above all mortal creatures. This appears by the expressions of respect that all he has is at her command. All he can do is wholly improve for her content and comfort. She lies in his bosom, and his heart trusts her, which forces all to confess that stream of his affection. Like a mighty current runs with full tide and strength. Marital love, he goes on to say, should be full of love, of ardent and robust, and their love should be of one of another. And William Googe says the faithful saints of God are no stoics without affection, which goes against everything we learn about Puritans, because today Puritans are considered stoic, cold-hearted, and yet when it comes to their married life, they're very much full of flame and affection towards their spouse. Edward Taylor, another Puritan, writes that his passion for his wife was a golden ball of pure fire. Piety, he reminds us, or faithfulness, godliness, that's more like along the lines of godliness. Piety must be at the foundation to maintain mutual affection. Godliness must be at the foundation to maintain mutual affection. Swinnock writes, when the root of love is wrong, the fruit will quickly be rotten. When the root of love is wrong, the fruit will quickly be rotten. In a marriage relationship, both the wife and the husband must maintain mutual affection for one another. They also must be faithful. There is a sense of fidelity in the relationship. One commentator later writes, our partners, talking about married couples, are partners in the nearest degree imaginable, and therefore, if unfaithful, the most foolish thieves that are possible. We must be faithful in estates, be faithful in names, and faithful in with bodies. There's an old proverb that used to say the man's business is to get and the woman's to keep and save. With regards to our estates. When it comes to your spouse's failings, should you broadcast them? Or should you conceal them? It is the duty of husbands and wives to guard each other's names and honor, even to conceal each other's weaknesses and failings. Because it's interesting because as the further you get into marriage, and we're going to be married 14 years here in a week and a half. I know it's big, Kenny. I know it's amazing. It'll be 14 years Tuesday. I didn't marry a perfect person.
Good thing you spoil it.
That is true. I would spoil it.
Nobody else would be perfect.
No. But you know how hard it is to remember that? If only she would do X, Y, and Z. And yet we must remember that we took on, when we married, she took on a sinful, frail, imperfect person, and I took on a sinful, frail, imperfect person. We did not take on, she didn't marry an angel, and I didn't marry an angel. She didn't marry a perfect person, I didn't marry a perfect person. Nor are either of us blameless. But sometimes we act that way. The expectation is of such that we expect perfection out of our spouse. We expect them to be blameless. And yet, in order to be faithful, we must understand that we are sinful creatures. Very similar to people in church today, that the reason they don't go to church anymore is because they're a bunch of hypocrites. The problem is we're all sinners. And the expectation is that, and we've said this before in messages, that I'm probably going to sin against you, you're probably going to sin against me. And the great thing about Christianity is the fact that I can forgive you and you can forgive me, not because of who I am or who you are, but because of what God has done for us. With George Swinnock, again, they thought to conceal each other's infirmities. It's wonderful folly for wives to publish their husbands' faults, and for husbands to proclaim their wives' weaknesses. Hereby they disparage and injure themselves. They disparage themselves both in blazing abroad their want of wit in making such an ill choice, and as they are sharers in each other's honor and disgrace. If we're going to be faithful to our spouse, we must help them in their failings and encourage them in their strengths. Because the more you are around somebody, the more the failings tend to become bigger and bigger. We also must be faithful with our bodies towards our spouse. Proverbs 5:18 through 19, let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as a loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. To the Reformers and Puritans, adultery is considered among most of them as one of the most heinous of sins. And so seriously that they take the responsibility of being faithful to fulfill marital duties within the bed, that those who fail to do so could be subject to church discipline. That's actually on record. story after story of women going before the pastor and then women going before the church saying their husband has been neglectful and taking care of them in the bed, and so the church would discipline them in public. If a woman was to have an affair back then, it was the man's fault because he wasn't doing his duties. Subject to church discipline and being put in an historical record. Proverbs 7:25, let not thine heart decline to her ways, go not astray in her paths. From Proverbs 7:27, her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. Marriage is honorable in all, Hebrews 13:4, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Men must have the highest thought, someone says, of their own wives, and women of their own husbands, and then they will not look so as to lust after others. But it should not just be in a physical realm that we look out for and be faithful to each other's bodies, but we also must help each other both in the secular and sacred things. Baxter says, to help each other only for your bellies is to live together but like beasts. If we are only consumed with the physical idea of the relationship and not the spiritual, how much better than we than beasts? If we are to love each other in obedience to God's command, right, we are to love one another, then we must love them according to God's command, which means to endeavor to each other's eternal welfare. We must be faithful with our bodies. We must be faithful with our names. We must be faithful with our estates or our personal possessions. We must have a marriage that is full of mutual affection. And if God hath called thee to this relation, mind holiness in it. Speaking to the man, thou art above thy wife in place, be above her in godliness. Thou shouldst draw thy wife and children along with thee to Christ by exemplary faithfulness or godliness. And so as we look at the marriage, we are now to husbands. We've looked at Ephesians 5:25-33 already. Duties of the husbands now is to love. To love. You see that in Ephesians 5:25-33. You see that in Colossians 3:19. Husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. If we were to consider all the duties of man at one time and all the duties of husbands, to be more accurate, they would all fall under the heading of love. But why love? Why not leadership? Why not authority? Why not faithfulness? Why not something else? Why is it the Bible commands the husband to love?
Well, it's considered the greatest of faith, hope, and charity.
Okay. Anybody else? Why? And that's a good answer, but why is the Bible command us as husbands to love above everything else?
Second commandment.
Second commandment. First commandment. Love the Lord your God with all thy heart, soul, and strength. We can't love God properly, and we can't love our neighbor properly, nor can we love our wife properly, or our children properly, or anybody else properly. Swinnock gives us two reasons for it. Very interesting. Partly, he says, because husbands are neglectful in love. Generally, he says, men are diligent in exercising dominion, authority, but they lack love. Negligent in regard to affection. We are to love with a sacrificial love. We are to love as Christ loves the church. The hard thing about that is we are to love as Christ loves the church, but we'll never reach that pinnacle. Because none of us are Christ. And yet that is something we should strive for, is to love our wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. The woman's creation also shows, and I think we looked at this last week, but also shows how great a husband's love for his wife should be. The love for my wife should exceed the love of my brothers. The love of my wife should exceed the love of my parents. The love of my wife should exceed the love of my in-laws. Next to God and Christ and his own salvation, my strongest affection should be for my wife, not my children, not my parents, but for my wife. It's interesting as you grow in Christianity, Christianity often holds things in tension, right? A prominent example is God is omniscient, is he not? We read that God knows everything, right? But we're to pray to him. Why should we pray to someone who already knows it before we're asking? Because he tells us to. And it's hard because, if you think about salvation, God knows who's going to get saved. But yet we're supposed to give people the gospel. God's the one who opens the eyes of the spiritual blind to salvation, and yet we're still supposed to give the gospel, and yet that's hard. We hold things in tension. And so it is in marriage. When the husband loves the wife, we should also lead the wife. And so sometimes in that tension, we either fall to one side of it or the other. So we to love our wives, but not in such a way that surrenders our responsibility to lead. But we are to lead in such a way that does not nullify our responsibility to love. Because if we love in such a way that nullifies our responsibility to love and lead, what happens in that? If we love too much that we don't lead, what happens?
The wife will rule.
The wife will rule. But if we lead too much without love, what happens?
She'll hate him.
She'll That backs it up quickly. He becomes authoritarian. Becomes a tyrant. The dominion of a man over his wife is not that of a master over his slave. But such as the soul has over the body. Not for its hurt, but for its health. To further its welfare. For edification, not for destruction. Paul writing to the church at Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 8, "For though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification, and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed." We are sure, as husbands, we should love, we should lead, and we should instruct. Wives are to learn from husbands at home. 1 Corinthians 14:35. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Husbands should instruct their wives in the things of God, both privately and patiently. It's not enough that we love, it's not enough that we lead, but we must love and lead in the things that are spiritual. Because it goes back to Richard Baxter says, if we had cared nothing for the spiritual welfare of our wife, or wives, plural this evening, then we're no different than the beasts of the field. And then we must not only instruct, love, and lead, we must be sympathetic and understanding. If we are to love as Christ has loved the church, there is somewhat of a sympathetic understanding in that. Because if you just think of yourself as a sinful creature, how much patience and understanding does Christ have just with you on a daily basis? Because there's no telling how many times we've come to him and tried to confess the same sin over and over and over again. And yet how often we as husbands expect perfection out of our wives. Even though they're sinful creatures just like we are. As one author writes, if we live with a difficult woman, we must excuse her faults and remember how our wives must bear us. Again, if we live with a difficult woman, we must excuse her faults and remember how our wives must bear us. For a good husband will either make a good wife or easily and profitably endure badly. A good husband will either make a good wife or easily and profitably endure badly. Any questions, comments, or thoughts on these? We